The day began like any other in the sterile, cold halls of the laboratory, buried deep beneath the Alaskan wilderness. The morning had brought the usual unease that settled in my stomach when I crossed the threshold into the facility, a feeling I had long since learned to ignore. But today, something was different. It wasn't just the biting chill in the air or the way the fluorescent lights seemed to flicker with a life of their own. No, it was the silence, an oppressive quiet that wrapped around me as I made my way through the familiar corridors, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Then it happened. The alarm pierced the stillness, a shrill, unrelenting sound that ricocheted off the reinforced concrete walls and drilled into my skull. My heart leaped into my throat as I stood frozen for a moment, my mind struggling to process what that alarm truly meant. It wasn't a drill. We hadn't scheduled one for months. This was real. The containment breach protocol, something I had hoped never to experience firsthand, had been activated. My worst fear, the one I had buried beneath layers of rationalization and scientific detachment, was now staring me in the face. I moved on instinct, my feet carrying me down the corridors toward the central control room. The familiar layout of the laboratory had become a maze, every turn bringing me closer to the reality I had long avoided. As I ran, I saw the red emergency lights flashing, casting eerie shadows that seemed to flicker with the unspoken horrors now lurking in the bowels of the facility. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, each step feeling heavier than the last. I couldn't help but think of the virus. 93, my creation, now set loose upon the very people I had worked alongside for years. The control room was in chaos when I arrived. Scientists, soldiers, and technicians were all scrambling, their faces masks of panic and disbelief. On the main screen, a live feed showed the lower levels of the facility, where the virus had first been stored, now overrun with something out of a nightmare. People, my colleagues, staggered and lurched, their skin pallid and their movements unnatural. I recognized one of them, Carl, the janitor, who had always greeted me with a nod and a smile. But now his eyes were vacant, his body contorted as if driven by some primal force. He wasn't Carl anymore. He was something else, something monstrous, brought into existence by my work. "Graham, we need to shut it down," a voice called out, snapping me back to reality. It was Dr. Howard, one of the senior scientists who had worked on X-93 alongside me. But there was no shutting it down, no easy fix. The virus had spread too quickly, moving faster than any of us had anticipated. My mind raced as I tried to think of a solution, any way to contain the outbreak before it escaped the facility. But the virus was designed to be unstoppable, to adapt and spread in ways that would outmaneuver any containment strategy. Before I could respond, a sudden crash echoed through the room, followed by screams. My head whipped around to see Carl, or what was once Carl, had broken through the reinforced glass window of the control room. He was inside, his once gentle face now twisted into a mask of rage and hunger. Panic erupted as everyone scattered, trying to escape the room, but there was no escape. Carl was too fast, too strong, his movements unnervingly fluid for a man who had once been a mere janitor. Instinct took over. I grabbed a metal chair and swung it at Carl as he lunged toward me. The impact sent him sprawling to the floor, but he was back on his feet in seconds, as if he hadn't felt a thing. I knew then that there was no saving him, no reversing what the virus had done. With a sickening realization, I understood that this was the true horror of X-93. It stripped away humanity, leaving behind only a shell driven by an insatiable need to spread the infection. I had no choice. I had to end it for Carl and for myself. With a heavy heart, I swung the chair again, this time with all my strength, and brought it crashing down on his head. The sickening thud echoed in the now silent room, and Carl collapsed, finally still. I stood there, chest heaving, staring down at the broken body of a man who had once been alive, who had once been a part of my world. And I realized with a cold dread that I was responsible for his death, for all the deaths that were happening now throughout the facility. The weight of that knowledge nearly crushed me, but there was no time for self-recrimination. I needed to find Emily. My ex-wife, the woman who had once been my partner in both life and work, was somewhere in this hellish labyrinth, and I needed to know she was safe. I left the control room, the echoes of Carl's death following me like a shadow, and made my way deeper into the facility, the alarm still blaring, its shrillness now a constant reminder of the nightmare I had unleashed. Every step I took was filled with dread. Each corner I turned revealing new horrors as the virus spread with terrifying speed. The once sterile and controlled environment of the laboratory had descended into chaos, with bodies lying crumpled in the halls, their faces twisted in pain and fear. I felt the chill of the Alaskan wilderness seeping into my bones, not just from the cold, but from the realization that there might be no escape from what I had created. Then, as I rounded a corner, I saw her, Emily. She was alive, thank God, but the look in her eyes told me that she had seen horrors of her own. There was no time for words, no time to process the complicated emotions that surged within me at the sight of her. We had to survive, and we had to do it together. Without a word, we fell into step beside each other, the past momentarily forgotten as we focused on the immediate danger. The facility was collapsing around us, and if we didn't act quickly, we would be buried with it. As we made our way toward the exit, the alarm continued to wail, a grim soundtrack to the destruction of everything we had known. But amidst the chaos, a single thought kept repeating in my mind. I would not let this be the end. I would find a way to fix this, to atone for the monstrous thing I had created. But first, we had to escape, and that was far from guaranteed. The sight of Emily, alive and determined, was a brief but potent relief amidst the unfolding nightmare. We moved quickly, our steps in sync, as if the years of estrangement had never occurred. The laboratory, once a sterile beacon of human achievement, was now a crumbling fortress of horror. The walls seemed to close in, the dim emergency lighting casting long shadows that danced with our growing fears. Every corner we turned brought us closer to the edge of despair, as the bodies of our colleagues lay strewn about, twisted and lifeless, or worse, reanimated by the virus I had so foolishly believed could be contained. We made our way to the rendezvous point, where the surviving staff and military personnel were supposed to regroup. The corridors that had once been so familiar now felt foreign, distorted by the chaos that had erupted within the walls. The air was thick with the stench of decay and the acrid smell of burning circuits from damaged equipment. My heart pounded in my chest as I wondered how many had survived, and if any escape was still possible. When we arrived at the rendezvous, the scene was grim. General Briggs, the man whose iron will had been the backbone of the facility's security, stood amidst the wreckage, barking orders to the few remaining soldiers. His face was set in a grimace of both determination and frustration. The lines on his weathered face seemed deeper, etched by the weight of the situation. I had never liked Briggs. His ruthlessness was too much for my scientific mind to reconcile. But in this moment, I was glad for his presence. He was a man who thrived in crisis, and if anyone could get us out of this, it was him. "Ellis, thank God you're here," Briggs grunted, his voice barely audible over the din of alarms and distant screams. "We've got a plan, but it's a long shot." Emily and I exchanged a glance, knowing full well that long shot might as well mean suicide mission in this context. But we had no other options. Briggs outlined the plan with the efficiency of a man used to giving orders in the heat of battle. We were to reach the surface, where a hidden airstrip lay in the forest, unknown to all but a select few. Emily's eyes widened when Briggs mentioned the airstrip, but she said nothing. Instead, she listened intently, her mind already working through the details of the plan. "We'll need to move fast," Briggs continued, "and we'll need every damn bit of firepower we can get. The infected are swarming the lower levels, and it's only a matter of time before they break through to the upper floors. We have to assume the worst, total facility breach." The weight of his words hung in the air, heavier than the suffocating stench that surrounded us. I felt a cold knot form in the pit of my stomach. A total breach meant there would be no quarantine, no containment. The virus would spread beyond these walls, and the consequences would be catastrophic. My mind raced, trying to think of any contingency plans, any last-minute solutions, but the reality was harsh and inescapable. We were out of time. As we prepared to move out, we heard a low groan echoing down the corridor. I turned, instinctively raising the makeshift weapon I had fashioned from a piece of debris earlier. Out of the shadows emerged Martin, barely recognizable, his body battered and broken. He had somehow survived longer than most, but the infection had taken its toll. His eyes, once sharp with intellect, were now clouded with pain and desperation. He staggered toward us, his mouth moving as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he collapsed at our feet, his body convulsing as the virus completed its work. Emily gasped, dropping to her knees beside him. Despite everything, despite his betrayal, despite the chaos, there was still a part of her that cared for him, but there was nothing she could do. Martin's eyes locked onto mine, and for a fleeting moment, I saw a glimmer of the man he had been. Then, with a final shudder, he was gone. The silence that followed was deafening, only to be shattered by Briggs' gruff voice. "We have to move," he said, not unkindly, but with the urgency of a man who knew that time was slipping through our fingers like sand. Emily stood, her face pale but resolute, and nodded. We all knew that morning would have to wait, if it was ever possible at all. The three of us, Briggs, Emily, and I, set out with the remnants of the security team, navigating through the maze of corridors that had once been our sanctuary. The facility's security systems had been compromised, and every door we passed through felt like stepping into the unknown. The infected were relentless, driven by a force that defied understanding. Their groans echoed through the halls, a constant reminder that death was never far behind. As we approached the final checkpoint before the surface, Briggs pulled me aside. His eyes were hard, unreadable. "Ellis, there's something you need to know," he began, his voice low. "This wasn't an accident. The outbreak, it was planned. By the very people who commissioned your research." I stared at him, unable to comprehend what he was saying. The ground beneath me seemed to shift, the last vestiges of certainty crumbling away. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Briggs nodded grimly. "Orders came down from the top. They wanted to see the virus in action, to study its effects in a controlled environment. Your team, you were all part of their experiment." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt sick, the bile rising in my throat. Everything I had done, everything I had sacrificed, had been for nothing but the whims of a shadowy group of decision-makers who saw us all as expendable. The virus, X-93, wasn't just a weapon. It was a test, and we were the subjects. Before I could respond, the sounds of gunfire and screaming erupted from the corridor behind us. The infected had found us, and they were closing in fast. There was no time to process what I had just learned, no time to grieve or rage. We had to move, to survive. But as we made our final push toward the surface, the weight of Briggs' revelation bore down on me, twisting the knife of guilt deeper into my soul. We reached the exit, the cold Alaskan air hitting us like a slap in the face. The night was dark, the forest around us silent and foreboding. Somewhere in that darkness lay the airstrip, our only chance of escape. But with every step we took, the knowledge of what had been done, what I had unwittingly been a part of, gnawed at me, a poison as potent as the virus itself. The cold hit us like a physical barrier the moment we stepped outside. The Alaskan wilderness was unforgiving, its icy breath seeping through our clothes, chilling us to the bone. The landscape, usually breathtaking in its raw beauty, now felt like an endless, frozen wasteland, a fitting backdrop to the hell we had just escaped. The facility loomed behind us, a monolith of concrete and steel, its lights flickering weakly in the distance, as if it too was struggling to survive the onslaught of the virus within. But we couldn't afford to look back. Every second we spent in the open was another second the infected could find us. The forest ahead was dense, the trees standing like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. We moved quickly, our breath coming in ragged clouds that dissipated into the night. The snow crunched under our boots, and I found myself wishing for the dead silence of the lab. At least there, the sounds were contained, predictable. Here, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig could mean death was lurking just out of sight. General Briggs took the lead, his military training evident in the way he navigated the terrain. Emily and I followed closely, our weapons ready, though I couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness. How do you fight something like this? Something that shouldn't even exist. I had always prided myself on being a man of science, of reason, but out here, surrounded by the bitter cold and the encroaching darkness, those things felt as distant as the life I had once known. As we pressed on, the forest seemed to close in around us, the trees growing thicker, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out what little light the moon offered. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, each inhale a sharp reminder of our mortality. I could see the strain on Emily's face, her skin pale and her eyes dark with exhaustion and fear. She was a fighter, she always had been, but I could tell that the events of the day were taking their toll. Martin's death weighed heavily on her, and though we hadn't spoken about it, the silence between us was thick with unresolved emotions. We reached a small clearing, and Briggs signaled for us to stop. He crouched low, scanning the area, and I realized that we weren't just avoiding the infected. The military had set up traps, and if we weren't careful, we could stumble right into one. The thought that our own people could be as deadly as the monsters we had created was a bitter pill to swallow. I felt a surge of anger and frustration, but I pushed it down. We couldn't afford any distractions, not now. The silence was suddenly broken by the distant sound of gunfire, followed by a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the trees. My heart skipped a beat, and I tightened my grip on the weapon in my hands. The infected were close, too close. I exchanged a glance with Emily, her eyes wide with fear, but there was something else there too, something that mirrored the turmoil I felt inside. There was no time to dwell on it. We had to keep moving. Briggs led us deeper into the forest, his pace quickening. The airstrip was close, but so were the infected. I could feel them, sense them in the darkness, their presence like a shadow creeping ever closer. The gunfire grew louder, more sporadic, and I knew that the soldiers who had been sent to contain the situation were now fighting for their lives. The containment had failed. Whatever orders they had been given, whatever protocols were in place, it didn't matter now. The virus was out, and there was no stopping it. As we approached the airstrip, the trees began to thin, and the ground beneath us turned to ice, slick and treacherous. The faint outline of the runway came into view, barely visible in the dim light. But we weren't the only ones who had made it this far. The silhouettes of soldiers moved in the distance, their figures stark against the white of the snow. I could see the tension in Briggs' posture as he signaled for us to stay low. These soldiers weren't here to help us. They were here to make sure no one left. We crept closer, using the cover of the trees to our advantage. The plan was simple: get to the plane, take off, and disappear before anyone could stop us. But as we drew nearer, I could see how fragile that plan really was. The soldiers were well armed, and they weren't going to let us waltz onto that plane without a fight. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on me, the enormity of what we were about to attempt. The lives of countless others hinged on our success, but all I could think about was the look in Emily's eyes, the unspoken question: could we really do this? The tension was palpable as we crouched behind the last line of trees, the plane just a few hundred feet away. Briggs was already calculating, his mind working out the best way to take out the soldiers without drawing too much attention. Emily's hand brushed against mine, a brief, wordless exchange of resolve. We had come too far to back down now. The cold air bit at my skin, the weight of the weapon in my hands a reminder of the reality we were about to face. With a deep breath, I nodded to Briggs. It was time. We were going to make our move, and there was no turning back. The forest had been our refuge, our shield against the horrors of the infected and the betrayals of the military. But now it would be the stage for our final act. The plane was our only chance, and we were going to take it or die trying. The air around us was electric with tension, every breath heavy with the anticipation of what was to come. The plane stood on the runway like a silent promise, its hulking form outlined against the pale snow, a beacon of hope in the frozen wilderness. But between us and that hope were the soldiers, guardians of a cruel, unforgiving mandate that saw us as expendable. The cold bit into my skin, but it was nothing compared to the icy resolve that had settled in my bones. We had no choice but to move forward, and the only way out was through them. Briggs motioned for us to fan out, his movements deliberate and calm. He was a man used to combat, and though I knew he had seen more than his share of battles, this was different. This was personal. He had known all along that we were pawns in a larger game, and now, with the end in sight, his resolve was as steely as the barrel of the rifle he held. Emily and I exchanged a glance. There was no need for words. The time for talking was over. All that was left was action. The first shot rang out like thunder, shattering the silence of the night. It was Briggs who fired, his aim true, taking down the nearest soldier before the others could react. In the heartbeat of a second, all hell broke loose. The soldiers opened fire, their bullets ripping through the air, biting into trees, and kicking up snow. We dove for cover, my heart hammering in my chest as I returned fire, the sound of gunfire, and shouted orders blending into a chaotic symphony of survival. Emily was a force beside me, her movements quick and precise, her aim deadly. I had always known she was capable, but seeing her now, in the midst of this deadly dance, I realized just how much I had underestimated her. She was fighting not just for herself, but for us, for whatever small chance of redemption and reconciliation we might have left. The thought fueled me, giving me the strength to push forward despite the overwhelming odds. But it was Briggs who bore the brunt of the fight. He was everywhere at once, a whirlwind of deadly precision. I saw him take down soldier after soldier, his determination burning like a fire that couldn't be extinguished. But then, just as we began to think we might have a chance, he took a hit. It wasn't a fatal wound, not immediately, but I could see the blood spreading across his side, a dark stain against the snow. He stumbled, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he didn't stop. If anything, he fought harder, with a ferocity that was almost terrifying. "Get to the plane," he shouted, his voice a command that cut through the chaos. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, torn between the instinct to help him and the understanding that this was our only chance. He saw the hesitation and fixed me with a glare that brooked no argument. "Go. I'll hold them off." Emily grabbed my arm, pulling me toward the plane. I looked back one last time, seeing Briggs standing tall despite his injury, his gun blazing as he provided the cover we needed. It was clear to both of us that he didn't intend to make it out of this. His sacrifice was the only way we were going to survive. The realization hit me like a physical blow, but there was no time to mourn, no time to process the gravity of what he was doing. We sprinted for the plane, the sound of gunfire still echoing in the background. The ramp was down, and we scrambled aboard, slamming it shut behind us. Emily ran to the cockpit, her hands moving over the controls with a familiarity that came from years of hidden talent. I could barely catch my breath, my heart pounding in my ears as I secured the hatch, sealing us in. The engines roared to life, a sound that was both terrifying and exhilarating. We were so close to getting out of this nightmare. As the plane began to move, I caught a glimpse of the runway behind us. Briggs was still standing, still fighting, but the soldiers were closing in. I wanted to scream, to tell him to run, to get on the plane with us. But I knew it was useless. He had made his choice, and it was one that would allow us to live. The plane surged forward, the ground falling away beneath us as we lifted into the air. I felt a wave of nausea, not from the flight, but from the sickening understanding that we were leaving him behind. We climbed higher, the facility and the forest below shrinking into the distance, becoming nothing more than a dark blur against the white snow. The weight of what we had done, of what we had lost, settled over me like a shroud. Emily's face was set in grim determination, but I could see the tears glistening in her eyes, unshed and unacknowledged. I wanted to reach out, to offer some comfort, but the words stuck in my throat. There was nothing I could say that would make this better, nothing that would ease the pain of what we had just survived. As we leveled out, the reality of our situation began to sink in. We were in the air, but we weren't safe, not yet. The military would be searching for us, and if they found us, there would be no mercy. Emily adjusted the controls, her movements efficient and controlled, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands gripped the yoke just a little too tightly. "Graham," she said quietly, not taking her eyes off the controls, "we can't just fly out of here. They'll track us, shoot us down before we get far enough." I nodded, the cold truth of her words settling over me like the snow we had just left behind. "Briggs gave me something," I said, pulling the small signal jammer from my pocket. It was a simple device, but one that could mean the difference between life and death. I handed it to her, watching as she quickly set it up, her hand steady despite the gravity of our situation. With the jammer activated, we had a slim chance of avoiding detection, but it was just that. Slim. We were out of options, out of plans. All we could do was keep flying, keep running, and hope that we could find somewhere to disappear, somewhere to start over. The silence in the cockpit was heavy, filled with the unspoken fears and unresolved grief that lingered between us. As we flew through the night, the adrenaline that had kept me going began to fade, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. I leaned back in the seat, my eyes drifting shut despite the fear gnawing at the edges of my mind. In that moment, with the darkness pressing in on all sides, the only thing I could hold onto was the fact that we were still alive. We had made it out, against all odds, and that had to be enough. But as sleep began to claim me, a nagging thought pushed its way to the forefront of my mind. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The virus, the betrayal, Briggs' sacrifice, these things would haunt me for the rest of my days. And somewhere deep inside, I knew that the world we were flying into was just as dangerous as the one we had left behind. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun.